My boss's daughter humiliated me at work. You're just a nobody here. Then her dad asked to meet. The plastic badge felt lighter than it should have. Temporary employee, Maya Chin. Analyst coverage. It read in bold red letters that seemed to scream my status to everyone who passed by. I clipped it to my blazer. A blazer I'd bought specifically for this job, spending money I didn't really have because first impressions mattered, especially when you were already starting from behind. Lancaster and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that reflected the Seattle skyline like a mirror. Everything here was pristine, expensive, and cold. The marble floors clicked under designer heels, the air smelled like expensive cologne and fresh coffee, and conversations happened in hushed tones that suggested million-dollar deals were being made over lunch. I was here to cover for Sarah Mitchell, a senior analyst who'd gone on maternity leave. At least, that's what HR told me during my brief orientation. 6 months, maybe 8. The woman had said, barely looking up from her computer screen. Just keep her desk warm and don't mess anything up. Simple enough, I thought. I needed the money. My student loans weren't going to pay themselves, and my tiny apartment in Capitol Hill wasn't going to keep itself. This job paid more in 6 months than I'd made in the past year waiting tables and doing freelance bookkeeping. I couldn't afford to mess it up. The other employees moved around me like I was invisible. They wore their permanent badges like medals, chatting about weekend trips to Aspen and wine tastings in Napa. I kept my head down, arrived early, stayed late, and tried to blend into the beige cubicle walls that surrounded Sarah's, now my, workspace. But here's the thing about being invisible. You see everything. I watched how the junior analysts kissed up to the senior partners, how they name-dropped their alma maters in casual conversation, how they somehow all knew each other from prep school or country clubs or family connections. This wasn't just a workplace. It was an ecosystem I'd never been part of, would never truly belong to. My background was different. Community college, state university, parents who worked double shifts to keep the lights on. I was smart, I knew that much. My professors had told me so. My grades proved it. But smart didn't always translate to fitting in, especially not here. The work itself was fascinating. Lancaster and Associates specialized in corporate restructuring and strategic development. They took failing companies and either saved them or stripped them for parts. It was ruthless, but there was an elegance to it that appealed to the part of me that loved solving puzzles. I threw myself into the projects assigned to me. Market analysis for a struggling tech startup. Financial projections for a retail chain considering bankruptcy. Due diligence reports that required combing through thousands of documents, looking for the needle in the haystack that would make or break a deal. The breakthrough came in my 3rd week. I was working on a project for Meridian Electronics, a mid-sized company that manufactured components for smartphones. They were hemorrhaging money, and the senior team was convinced they needed to downsize dramatically, maybe even sell off their R&D department. But something in the numbers didn't add up. I spent my lunch breaks and several nights until 2 a.m. digging deeper into their financials, their supply chain, their market position. What I found was a company that wasn't failing because of bad products or poor management. They were failing because they were stuck in the past, manufacturing outdated components while the market had moved toward newer technology. The solution wasn't downsizing. It was pivoting. I drafted a comprehensive proposal outlining how Meridian could retool their existing facilities to manufacture next-generation components. The initial investment would be significant, but the potential returns were enormous. The smartphone market was exploding, and there was a massive shortage of the specific components Meridian could produce with minor modifications to their existing equipment. I ran the numbers 3 times, then had them checked by 2 different software programs. The math was solid. The market research was thorough. The timeline was realistic. When I finished the proposal, it was 47 pages of detailed analysis, complete with charts, graphs, and a phased implementation plan. I'd never worked so hard on anything in my life. I submitted it on a Thursday afternoon, sending it directly to the senior partner overseeing the Meridian account, James Crawford, a man with silver hair and handmade suits who spoke in numbers the way poets spoke in metaphors. Friday came and went with no response. Monday morning, I watched as Crawford presented his analysis of the Meridian situation to the executive team. I sat in the back of the conference room, taking notes as he outlined a strategy that sounded remarkably familiar. The pivoting approach, the retooling timeline, even some of the specific language I'd used in my proposal. He never mentioned my name, never acknowledged where the idea had come from. When the CEO praised the innovative thinking and outside-the-box approach, Crawford simply nodded and accepted the credit. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not yet, but definitely crack. After the meeting, I approached Crawford in the hallway. "Excuse me, Mr. Crawford? I was wondering if you had any feedback on the Meridian proposal I submitted last week." He looked at me with a mild annoyance of someone being interrupted by a telemarketer. "Proposal? I'm sorry, miss."
Chun.
Maya Chun. I'm covering for Sarah Mitchell. Right, the temp. He glanced at his watch, a Rolex that probably cost more than my car. "I'm not sure what proposal you're referring to. If you have concerns about your assignments, perhaps you should speak with your supervisor." And he walked away. That's when I learned my first real lesson about Lancaster and Associates. Your ideas could belong to anyone with a permanent badge. Your work could disappear into someone else's presentation. Your contributions could evaporate like morning mist. But I couldn't quit. I needed this job. I needed the reference, the experience, the money. So I swallowed my pride, smiled when people ignored me, and kept working. I told myself it was temporary. The badge said so. But as I sat in my cubicle that afternoon, watching Crawford receive congratulations for his brilliant strategy, I wondered if being temporary was less about the duration of my employment and more about how expendable everyone considered me to be. The crack in my chest widened just a little bit more. I had no idea that everything I was experiencing, the invisibility, the stolen credit, the casual dismissal, was being watched, noted, evaluated. I had no idea that my real test hadn't even begun yet. The Hartwell Industries presentation was supposed to be my chance to redeem myself. After the Meridian fiasco, I'd thrown myself into this project with desperate determination. 3 weeks of 18-hour days, living on vending machine sandwiches and gas station coffee, building a comprehensive restructuring plan for a manufacturing company on the brink of collapse. This time, I'd been specifically asked to present. Not Crawford, not one of the senior analysts, me. Maya Chun, the temp with the red badge. The conference room was Lancaster and Associates' crown jewel, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a mahogany table that could seat 20, and chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd rehearsed my presentation until I could recite it backwards, checked my slides 17 times, and arrived 30 minutes early to set up. Deep breaths, I whispered to myself, straightening my blazer. The same blazer I'd worn for weeks now, hoping nobody would notice I rotated between 3 different shirts to create the illusion of variety. The senior partners filed in first, Crawford with his silver hair and perpetual smirk, Elizabeth Manning with her razor-sharp bob and sharper tongue, and David Wu, who never spoke but somehow managed to make everyone nervous just by existing. Then came the junior analysts, all of them looking like they'd stepped out of AJ.Crew catalog. I was clicking through to my first slide when she walked in. Sierra Lancaster. I'd heard whispers about the CEO's daughter, but this was the first time I'd seen her in person. 26, maybe 27, with honey blonde hair that fell in perfect waves and a designer suit that probably cost more than my rent. She moved through the room like she owned it, which technically she did. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, not sounding sorry at all. Traffic was bad coming back from brunch. She settled into the chair directly across from me, crossing her legs and pulling out her phone. Nobody questioned her presence. Nobody asked who'd invited her. She was simply allowed to be there, the way gravity was simply allowed to exist. "Sierra will be observing today as part of our strategic advisory process," Crawford explained, though his tone suggested he was as surprised by her appearance as I was. I cleared my throat and began. "Thank you all for being here. Today I'll be presenting our analysis of Hartwell Industries and our recommendations for moving forward." The first 10 minutes went smoothly. I outlined Hartwell's current financial position, their market challenges, their competitive disadvantages. My slides were clean, my data was solid, and I could see heads nodding around the table. Then I got to the numbers. Based on our analysis, we project that implementing our recommended changes will result in a 23% reduction in operational costs over the first 18 months, with break-even occurring in month 14. Sierra looked up from her phone. I'm sorry, did you say 23%? Yes, that's correct. The projection accounts for. That's impossible. She set her phone down with a sharp click. I've been reviewing similar restructuring projects, and the industry standard for cost reduction in manufacturing is 8 to 12%. 23% is fantasy. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. Actually, if you look at slide 12, you'll see that our projections are based on. I don't need to look at your slides. Her voice carried the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no. I need to look at reality. These numbers are embarrassing. The room had gone completely silent. I could feel 20 pairs of eyes watching this exchange, waiting to see how I'd respond. My hands were shaking slightly, but I pressed on. The 23% figure comes from 3 main areas of optimization. First, we identified significant redundancies in their supply chain management. Second, their current inventory system is... Stop. Sierra held up her hand like a traffic cop. Just stop. This is painful to watch. She stood up, walked around the table, and stopped directly beside my laptop. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that probably came in a bottle shaped like a sculpture. You know what your problem is? She said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You're thinking like a temp, like someone who doesn't understand how real business works. My face was burning. I've run these numbers multiple times. The methodology is sound. The methodology is amateur. She reached for her coffee cup, a pristine white ceramic mug with the Lancaster and Associates logo. It was still half full, steam rising from the dark liquid inside. And then she poured it. Slowly, deliberately, she tipped the mug and let the coffee splash across my printed presentation materials. The hot liquid soaked through 17 copies of 43 pages of work, turning charts into brown smears and making graphs illegible. Don't act like you belong at this table, she said, her voice honey-sweet with venom. You're just the temp. The coffee was still dripping onto the floor. The sound seemed deafeningly loud in the absolute silence that followed her words. I stared at the ruined papers, at weeks of work dissolving into unreadable mush. My throat felt tight, and I could feel tears building behind my eyes. Not here. Not in front of these people. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Crawford studied his hands. Manning checked her phone. Wu stared out the window like something fascinating was happening in the parking lot. I gathered what was left of my materials, coffee-stained and dripping, and walked toward the door. My legs felt unsteady, like I was walking on a boat in rough seas. Maya, Crawford called out as I reached the doorway. We'll reschedule this presentation for next week. I didn't turn around. No, I said quietly. I don't think you will. The walk back to my cubicle felt like a death march. I could hear the conference room door close behind me, then the immediate buzz of conversation resuming. They were probably already moving on to the next agenda item, already forgetting about the temp who'd just been publicly humiliated. I sat down at my desk and stared at my computer screen. The cursor blinked expectantly, waiting for me to do something productive. Instead, I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out the cardboard box I'd been avoiding thinking about. The one I'd brought on my first day, just in case. It was time to pack. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my couch, staring at the coffee stains on my blouse that no amount of cold water could remove, replaying Sierra's words over and over. You're just the temp. The way she'd said it, like I was something unpleasant she'd found stuck to her shoe. By morning, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to wait to be fired. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of dismissing me. I would leave on my own terms, with whatever dignity I had left. I arrived at Lancaster and Associates at 7:30 a.m., an hour before most people showed up. The building felt different in the early morning quiet, less intimidating, more hollow. The marble floors that had once seemed prestigious now just looked cold. My desk was exactly as I'd left it. The coffee-stained presentation materials sat in my trash can like evidence of a crime. I pulled out the cardboard box and began the ritual of dismantling 6 weeks of temporary employment. The personal items didn't take long. A small, succulent plant my sister had given me for good luck, a coffee mug from my college bookstore, 3 pens that actually worked, a photo of my parents from their anniversary dinner, both of them grinning in their best clothes at a restaurant they'd saved up for months to afford. The professional materials were more complicated. Files I'd created, reports I'd written, analysis I'd completed. All of it technically belonged to Lancaster and Associates. But some of it felt like mine. The late nights I'd spent perfecting financial models. The insights I'd discovered buried in spreadsheets. The solutions I'd crafted to problems nobody else had bothered to solve. I decided to leave it all. Let them have it. Maybe someone else would get credit for my work again, but I wouldn't have to watch it happen. Leaving already? I looked up to find Janet, one of the cleaning staff, pushing her cart past my cubicle. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to notice everything. We'd exchanged pleasantries during late nights when I was the only one left in the office and she was making her rounds. Something like that, I said, closing the flaps on my box. Janet glanced around to make sure we were alone, then stepped closer. I heard what happened yesterday. In the conference room. My cheeks burned. Of course she'd heard. Bad news traveled fast in places like this, especially when it involved the boss's daughter putting someone in their place. Word of advice? Janet continued, her voice gentle but firm. That girl has done this before. 3 times, actually. Always to people she thinks are beneath her. Always in public. Always with witnesses who suddenly develop selective hearing. I looked up at her, surprised. Janet had never spoken to me about anything more personal than the weather. The thing is, she said, adjusting her cleaning supplies, her father doesn't know. Or at least he didn't used to know. But people talk, even when they think they're being discreet. She gave me a meaningful look, then continued down the hallway with her cart squeaking softly against the marble floor. By 9 a.m., the office was filling up with the usual morning energy. Conversations about weekend plans, complaints about traffic, the general hum of productivity beginning. I kept my head down, boxing up the last of my belongings. Nobody said anything to me directly, but I caught the sideways glances. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked past. I was now officially part of office folklore, another cautionary tale about knowing your place. Crawford walked by my desk twice, without acknowledging my existence. Elizabeth Manning gave me a thin smile that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. The junior analysts avoided eye contact entirely, probably terrified that whatever I had might be contagious. By 11 a.m., I was done. 6 weeks of work life reduced to a single cardboard box that wasn't even full. I sat at my desk for a moment, looking at the clean surface, the empty drawers, the blank computer screen. It was like I'd never been there at all. I stood up, picked up my box, and started walking toward the elevator. This was it. No dramatic exit speech, no burning bridges, no final confrontation. Just a quiet retreat from a battle I'd never really had a chance to win. Maya Chun. I turned around to find a woman in a navy blue suit standing behind me. I didn't recognize her, but she carried herself with the same polished authority as everyone else in senior management. Yes, I'm Sarah from HR. Could I speak with you for a moment? My stomach dropped. Here it comes, I thought. The official termination. The security escort. The final humiliation. Actually, Sarah said, glancing at the box in my arms. Could you put that down? Mr. Lancaster would like to see you in his office.
Now.
Mr. Lancaster.
The CEO.
Sierra's father. I'd never spoken to him directly. I'd seen him in company meetings, a tall man with silver hair and sharp suits who commanded attention just by walking into a room. He was the kind of person who made decisions that affected hundreds of lives without ever knowing their names. Am I being fired? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sarah's expression was unreadable. He just wants to talk. Please follow me. I set my box down on my former desk and followed her toward the executive elevator, the one I'd never been allowed to use. As we rose to the top floor, I tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. At least it would be quick. At least I'd finally know where I stood. The executive floor was everything I'd imagined: thick carpets, oil paintings, the kind of quiet that came from being insulated from the chaos below. Sarah led me down a hallway lined with portraits of distinguished-looking men in expensive suits, all of them looking like they'd never questioned their right to be exactly where they were. We stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate: Richard Lancaster, CEO. "He's waiting for you," Sarah said, knocking twice before pushing the door open. I walked into the office, expecting to find my ending. Instead, I found my beginning. Richard Lancaster was not what I expected. Behind the massive oak desk sat a man who looked tired, not just end-of-the-day tired, but soul-deep exhausted. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, his tie was loosened, and when he looked up at me, I saw something I hadn't anticipated: genuine remorse. "Ms. Chun," he said, standing up. "Please sit down." The chair across from his desk was leather, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I perched on the edge of it, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the axe to fall. "I owe you an apology," he said. I blinked. In all my scenarios of how this conversation might go, that wasn't one of them. "Sir?" He walked around to the front of his desk and leaned against it, studying me with sharp blue eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of Sierra's. "What happened yesterday in that conference room was unacceptable. My daughter had no right to treat you, or anyone, that way." "It's fine," I said automatically, the way you're trained to deflect when someone with power acknowledges they've hurt you. "Really, I understand."
No. His voice was firm.
"It's not fine, and I don't think you understand at all." He walked to the window overlooking the city, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he didn't speak. I sat in the expensive chair, confused and increasingly uncomfortable. "Tell me, Miss Chen, what do you know about your position here?" I frowned. "I'm covering for Sarah Mitchell while she's on maternity leave. Temporary analyst position, 6 to 8 months. He turned around, and there was something almost sad in his expression. "Sarah Mitchell doesn't exist." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my brain trying to process them, like a computer struggling with corrupted data. "I'm sorry, what?" "There is no Sarah Mitchell. There never was. We created that identity, that backstory, that entire narrative." He moved back to his desk, pulled out a thick folder, and set it in front of me. There was no maternity leave to cover. No position that needed filling. I stared at the folder without opening it. "I don't understand." 6 months ago, I implemented a new hiring protocol. Instead of traditional interviews and background checks, we started identifying promising candidates and placing them in, let's call them, pressure situations. We wanted to see how people performed when they thought no one was watching, how they handled being ignored, dismissed, or undervalued. My mouth felt dry. "You were testing me?" "The entire time." He sat back down, his fingers steepled. "We've been watching how you work when you think your contributions don't matter, how you handle having your ideas stolen, how you respond to being treated as invisible." The room seemed to tilt slightly. 6 weeks of humiliation, of fighting for recognition, of feeling like I was losing my mind. It had all been deliberate. "The Meridian proposal," I said slowly, "Crawford taking credit, was part of the test. We needed to see how you'd react to having your work appropriated. Would you quit? Would you confront him? Would you become bitter and stop trying?" I thought about all those late nights, all the extra effort I'd put in despite being ignored. And yesterday? Sierra destroying my presentation. His expression darkened. That was not part of the test. The anger in his voice was unmistakable. I'd never heard a parent sound so disappointed in their child. Sierra knew about the hiring protocol. She knew you were being evaluated. But what she did yesterday... He shook his head. That was her deciding to flex her power because she could. Because she thought you were beneath her. I felt something shifting inside me, like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. So, everything I went through was designed to identify natural leaders. People who maintain their integrity under pressure. Who continue to perform even when they're not getting recognition. He leaned forward, You exceeded every expectation we had. He slid the folder across the desk. Until yesterday. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The first page was a job description, lead analyst, strategic development division. The salary was 3 times what I'd been making as a temp. The second page was a contract with my name already typed at the bottom. I don't understand, I whispered. We were going to offer you the position next week. The whole charade would have been revealed, apologies would have been made, and you would have been welcomed into the company as a permanent, valued member of our senior analysis team. I looked up at him. Would have been. What my daughter did yesterday crossed a line. It wasn't testing your professional capabilities. It was personal humiliation. It was cruel. His jaw tightened. I've spent the last 18 hours trying to decide if we can move forward after what happened. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. And Richard Lancaster smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. Miss Chun, would you like to know how someone responds to being publicly humiliated by the boss's daughter? I nodded, not trusting my voice. They maintain their dignity. They don't lash out or make a scene. They quietly pack their things and prepare to leave with their head held high.
He tapped the contract.
That tells me everything I need to know about your character. I stared at the papers in front of me. Lead analyst. Permanent position. Recognition for the work I'd actually done. There's just one thing, he said. I need to know that you can handle working here knowing what we put you through. And knowing that my daughter is still part of this company. I thought about Janet's words in the hallway. About Sierra's pattern of behavior. About all the people who'd been where I was, who hadn't made it through the test. Mr. Lancaster, I said, finding my voice. I think it's time Sierra learned what it feels like to earn her place at the table. His smile widened. I was hoping you'd say that. We were discussing the details of my transition timeline when the door burst open without a knock. Sierra Lancaster stormed in like a hurricane in designer heels, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed with what looked like rage. She stopped short when she saw me sitting across from her father's desk, the contract still spread out between us. What is she doing here? Sierra's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Sierra. Her father's tone carried a warning that would have made most people take a step back. I don't recall inviting you to this meeting. I heard from Jennifer in HR that you called the temp up here. She practically spat the word temp like it was something distasteful. Please tell me you're not about to do something stupid like give her severance pay. After what happened yesterday, we should be worried about lawsuits, not. Sit down. The command was quiet but absolute. Richard Lancaster had transformed from the apologetic man I'd been speaking with into someone who could stop conversations across a crowded room with a single look. Sierra's mouth opened to argue, then closed. For the first time since I'd known of her existence, she looked uncertain. Sit down. She took the chair next to mine with obvious reluctance, pointedly not looking in my direction. I could smell that expensive perfume again, but now it seemed cloying rather than elegant. Sierra, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, her father began, his hands flat on the desk. Ms. Chun was never a temporary employee. Sierra's head snapped toward him. What? For the past 6 weeks, she has been participating in our executive evaluation program. Everything she experienced, the dismissals, the ignored contributions, the stolen credit, was designed to assess her leadership potential under adverse conditions. I watched Sierra's face cycle through confusion, realization, and then something that looked almost like panic. That's not possible, she said weakly. I would have known. You did know. His voice was ice cold. I specifically told you about the program when it began. I told you we had a candidate being evaluated, and I expected your cooperation in maintaining the professional environment necessary for accurate assessment. Sierra's perfect composure was cracking. I forgot. I thought she was just. You thought she was just what? Just a temp whose feelings didn't matter? Just someone beneath your notice whose dignity was expendable. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. I sat perfectly still, afraid that moving would break whatever spell was keeping Sierra quiet. What you did yesterday, her father continued, was not part of any evaluation. It was a deliberate, cruel humiliation of someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Someone who, I might add, had been performing at the highest level despite being systematically undervalued. Sierra finally looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something I'd never expected to see in her eyes: shame. "I didn't know," she whispered. "But you should have," I said, surprising myself by speaking. "Even if I had been just a temp, even if I had been the lowest person in this building, what you did was wrong." Sierra flinched like I'd slapped her. "You poured coffee on weeks of my work because you could. Because you thought your last name gave you the right to humiliate people in front of their colleagues. Because you've never had to earn respect, you've just expected it to be handed to you." My voice was steady, controlled. Not angry, just honest. "You want to know what the difference is between us?" I continued. "I've spent 6 weeks proving I belong here. You've spent your entire life assuming you do." Sierra's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. She looked to her father for support, but found none. "Maya is right," he said quietly. "And this isn't the first time, is it? Jennifer mentioned there have been other incidents. Other people you've treated poorly because you thought you could." "They were just," Sierra started, then caught herself. "Just what? Just nobodies? Just people who didn't matter?" She looked at her hands, her confidence evaporating. "Here's what's going to happen," Richard continued. "Maya is being promoted to lead analyst, effective immediately. She'll be overseeing strategic development projects, including several that you've been consulting on." Sierra's head jerked up. "She can't. She can, and she will. She's earned it through 6 weeks of exceptional work under impossible conditions. She's shown more leadership potential in a month and a half than you've shown in your entire life." The words hit Sierra like physical blows. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "You have a choice, Sierra," her father said. "You can learn to work with Maya as her colleague and respect her authority on the project she leads, or you can find somewhere else to apply your talents." Sierra looked between us, her face pale. For the first time since I'd met her, she had no smart remark, no cutting comment, no casual dismissal. "Do you understand?" her father asked. She nodded silently.
Good.
"Maya, welcome to the senior team. Sierra, I suggest you take some time to think about the kind of professional you want to be." Sierra stood up unsteadily and walked toward the door. Just before she reached it, she turned back. "I'm sorry," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the privileged princess who'd humiliated me, but a young woman who'd just realized that her entire worldview had been built on quicksand. "I know," I said, "but apologies don't undo damage. They just make it possible to move forward." She nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. For the first time in 6 weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. That, said Richard Lancaster, was exactly the kind of leadership I was hoping to see. 3 weeks later, I sat at the head of the same mahogany conference table where Sierra had humiliated me. The irony wasn't lost on me, or anyone else in the room. My badge was no longer red plastic with bold letters screaming, "Temporary." It was brushed silver with elegant black text, "Maya Chen, Lead Analyst, Strategic Development." It felt substantial in a way that had nothing to do with the material it was made from. "Good morning, everyone," I said, looking around the room at faces that had once looked through me like I was invisible. Now they watched me with the careful attention reserved for people who could influence their careers. "Thank you for being here. Today we'll be reviewing the Morrison Industries proposal and finalizing our recommendation for the board." Crawford sat to my right, the same man who had stolen my meridian analysis and presented it as his own. Now he nodded respectfully when I spoke and took notes when I outlined strategy. The transformation was almost comical if it weren't so revealing about how this place really worked. Elizabeth Manning, who had barely acknowledged my existence as a temp, now offered input with phrases like, "building on Maya's excellent point," and "as Maya suggested in her preliminary analysis." David Wu, the perpetually silent senior partner, actually spoke during my meetings, something that apparently never happened in anyone else's presentations. But it was Sierra's presence that made the whole scene surreal. She sat in the corner, in a chair that had been brought in specifically for her, not at the table beside it. She held a legal pad and took notes, but she didn't speak unless directly asked a question. When she did respond, it was with "Yes, Maya," or "I'll look into that, Maya," or "That's a good point, Maya." The mighty had indeed fallen. I'd expected to feel more satisfaction about her reduced circumstances. Instead, I found myself watching her with something approaching professional curiosity. She was learning, I realized. Slowly, painfully, but genuinely learning what it meant to earn respect rather than command it. "Sierra," I said during a pause in the discussion, "you've been reviewing the Morrison Industries file. What's your assessment of their current market position?" She looked up, clearly surprised to be called upon. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Sierra, the one who would have delivered her opinion with absolute authority, regardless of whether she'd actually done the work. But instead, she glanced down at her notes and said, "I think their position is weaker than they're presenting to us. Their market share has dropped by 4% in the last 18 months, and their main competitor just secured 2 major contracts that Morrison was bidding on. I think we need to factor that into our projections." It was a solid observation. I nodded approvingly. "Good catch. That aligns with what I found in the quarterly reports. Elizabeth, can you have your team run some scenarios based on that revised market share?" The meeting continued for another hour. We discussed timelines, risk assessments, and implementation strategies. I guided the conversation, synthesized different viewpoints, and made decisions that would affect millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. This was what I dreamed of during all those late nights as a temp, being the person in the room whose voice mattered, whose ideas shaped outcomes, whose judgment was trusted. As the meeting wrapped up, people gathered their materials and began filing out. Sierra approached my chair, waiting until we were alone. "Maya," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you." I looked up from my laptop. "For what?" "For not destroying me when you had the chance." She shifted uncomfortably, like someone unused to having serious conversations. "After what I did to you, you could have made my life hell. You could have convinced my father to fire me, or at least remove me from all strategic projects." I studied her face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen in her before: humility. "I thought about it," I admitted. "But revenge isn't the same as justice. And honestly, I think you're learning more from this arrangement than you would have learned from being cast out." She nodded slowly. "I've never had to prove myself before. I've never had to wonder if my ideas were good enough, or if people respected my judgment. I just assumed they did because of my name. And now I realize that respect based on fear or obligation isn't really respect at all."
She paused.
"The work you've been giving me, the research projects, the analysis assignments, they're teaching me things I never learned in business school." I smiled. "Like what?" "Like how to be wrong and admit it. Like how to build an argument based on facts instead of authority. Like how to collaborate instead of just expecting people to defer to me." She was different, I realized. Not completely transformed. That would take years, but genuinely different. The cruel entitlement had been replaced by something approaching actual professionalism.
"Keep learning," I said.
"And maybe someday you'll earn a seat back at this table." After she left, I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The same view I'd admired during my first day as a temp, but everything else had changed. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder, coffee-stained and wrinkled, but still readable. My original Hartwell Industries presentation, the one Sierra had destroyed. I'd kept it, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of where I'd started, a reminder of what I'd endured, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives are just the beginning of our best ones. I ran my fingers over the brown stains that had once symbolized my powerlessness. Now they just looked like coffee spills on paper. Nothing more, nothing less. The coffee stain was still there, but I was no longer the same person who had been humiliated by it. And that made all the difference.